Proszę Państwa, najwyższy czas na debatę dotyczącą scenariuszy gospodarczych dla Europy. W naszym studiu EKF w Gdańsku są już Janusz Lewandowski, poseł do Parlamentu Europejskiego, i Ludwik Kotecki, dyrektor Instytutu Odpowiedzialnych Finansów. Proszę Państwa, gośćmi prowadzących będą ekonomiści z unijnych instytucji finansowych, europejskich central banków, firm konsultingowych, ale te sprawy zostawiam już Panom i przekazuję głos. Zapraszam.
Dziękuję bardzo. We will present today the macroeconomic scenarios for Europe in English. So for those who needs translation, please use it. We had just listened to Polish Minister of Finance presenting perspectives and forecasts for Poland, but now we can shift to Europe. I mean, not only Poland, but the whole Europe, and European scenarios after coronavirus will be the first part of this discussion to our discussion on macroeconomic issues relevant and valid for Europe. We start from, as I said, European economy after coronavirus, so the macroeconomic scenarios and forecast for Europe. As you know, the euro area, the EU, and in fact the whole world is still operating far below its pre-pandemic level. And while the pandemic was a common shock across the euro area and EU countries, developments in economic activity across countries were different. And today we would like to discuss with our distinguished guests some issues related to this situation. First of all, we start with the symmetry and asymmetry of shock for countries and for the recovery of these countries. We will discuss the shape or shapes of recovery if they are different across countries. We will discuss also imbalances after COVID, lessons learned so far from COVID-19, but also EU recovery fund and plan, to what extent it will be timely and effective in the recovery. And last but not least, I hope that we will learn something from our guests, from our panelists, about numeric forecast. So today we have invited 5 distinguished economists from whole Europe, and I will start in alphabetic order by presenting Antonio Cortina, who is Deputy Director of the Research of Santander Bank. Then the second macroeconomist we will have pleasure to listen to is Mr. Michał Dybuła, Chief Economist from BNP Paribas Bank Polska. Then Deborah Revortella, Director of the Economics Department of the European Investment Bank. Stefan Schneider, Chief German Economist, Deutsche Bank. And Jal Salfin, Chief Economist at KPMG in the United Kingdom. Janusz, do you want to say something at the beginning?
Good afternoon. As there are not so many reasons for good spirit in Europe nowadays, I am to revoke Jean Monnet, one of the grounding fathers of the European Union, saying that Europe would only be forged in crisis, meaning Europe is facing crisis, Europe is rising to the challenge, and drawing lessons and advancing integration. 3 times already within this decade, we are testing that sort of thinking about Europe. Each time, the crisis is born outside Europe. Financial crisis exported across Atlantic, migration crisis due to the drama in the Middle East, and now virus made in China. Of course, it needs extra reactions at the national and supranational level, as usual. And for me, what is interesting is the expansion of the European Commission becoming a major player in the financial markets, going to raise more than 750 billion euro in the market, plus 100 for so-called SURE program. That was even more than so-called pandemic and emergency purchase program by ECB before extension of this program by 600 billion euro. So interesting reshuffle in the institutions, interesting to see and to hear from you your scenarios for the future. And let us start with Mrs. Deborah Revoltella, Director of the Economics Department of the European Investment Bank. Please.
Just checking whether you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. And it's really an honor to be able to join this event and have this opportunity for discussion. I wanted to give a few remarks and present a presentation on the views that we have in terms of the impact of the COVID crisis at the European level. And the key message, it's clear by now that we are seeing a massive shock, and the massive shock is followed by something that we call a truncated V recovery, and I will soon explain what I will mean about it. Investment is strongly affected, and uncertainty will remain a key drag in the recovery. And despite the very strong policy effort, both on the monetary policy side and on the fiscal side, what we are seeing is that the crisis is leading to a structural change, which requires also the corporate sector to adapt. And what we see is the need to focus on smart and green going forward. If we can go to the next slide. In the first slide is what I had in mind in terms of the strong impact of the economy and the shape of the recovery. In the first graph, we see the massive effect. I also was looking at industrial output data as well as business confidence data for European countries. And what you see is the biggest shock that we have seen. Now we start seeing a recovery. The latest data up to August were showing quite a vivid recovery in most of the EU countries. But already September data started showing that this recovery is somehow flattening. And the point that we have in mind is that there is still a huge uncertainty in front of us, and the huge uncertainty is actually constraining the full recovery back to pre-crisis trends. In our expectation, we think that up to the end of 2022, we will still remain below the pre-crisis trend dynamics. If we look at the next slides, it shows the dynamics in terms of investment that we have seen so far. The way in which we show it is to compare before to the period investment dynamics in a cumulated way, taking 2008, so before the financial and sovereign debt crisis, as a comparison. So in that way, we can see the effect of the first financial crisis and sovereign crisis, and then the effect of the current crisis on investment dynamics. The impact is huge. Also, for what we see now, actually we have almost a 20% cumulative drop in the first two quarters of 2020 compared to the end of 2019. And it's a massive shock that actually mimics quite well what we have seen in the past financial and sovereign crisis. And as I was saying, there is a strong component related to uncertainty, where the uncertainty is related, we used to say, related to three dimensions. On the one side, it's the medical uncertainty. We now see a revival in contagion in most of the countries of Europe. We don't know when immunization will come and when a vaccine will be released. So it's a lot of medical uncertainty. But then it's not only that. The second source of uncertainty is when the second round effect of the economic crisis will start kicking in. And there we have the effect of, despite the strong policy support, the risk of non-performing loans coming up and the impact of corporate failures in the economy, this is a second source of uncertainty. And then the third one is related to change in long-term trends. And here we don't know what will be in the long term in terms of change in individual preference, global value chains, new business model, the rule of the states. So altogether, with these three areas of uncertainty, we think that the recovery will take time, will not be immediate, and particularly on the investment dynamics, we see a lot of constraining factors. If we go to the next slides, we have started to look at more in detail at what are the risks for the corporate sector. We did a study recently looking at the balance sheet of European firms. It's a huge database with balance sheet information. And we were doing some simulation in terms of what will happen with the lockdown first and with several months of recovery. All in all, we expect that there will be a strong, given the cash buffers of different firms, we may have an impact in terms of net revenues, cumulated net revenues losses that are quite strong, both for small and medium enterprises and large enterprises, going around 3% for large corporate, and from 6 to 11% for the smaller one. This will require time for firms to absorb these net revenue losses, and we think that in the medium to long term, firms will have to have a trade-off in the way of reabsorbing these losses. And the trade-off is between constraining more investment or accepting to get more credit in order to support investment. So there will be a trade-off between leverage and investment activities. We are also looking at firms, and actually we just did a survey that interviews 12,000 firms in Europe, trying to understand, asking to the firms what is their perception of the immediate impact of COVID crisis on their own investment plans. We have that more than 45% of firms are telling us that they will reduce investment plan due to COVID. We also ask to the firms what they think will be the effect of COVID in the long term for the firm. And we have more than 50% telling us that COVID will bring something different in terms of their use of digital technologies, but also a large share says service and product and supply chains. So it seems that COVID will bring a new normal, and firms will have to adapt to this new normal, and actually this means more investment. So on the one side, we have the shock, the economic shock, the uncertainty, and everything that is leading to an immediate reduction on investment. On the other side, we have long-term needs that are even more pressing because COVID is generating a long-term change. So on a policy point of view, what becomes more and more important is how to restart this investment and how to get back to a track in which firms can invest to adapt to the new transformation. And the new transformation, as I was saying, is related to a number of elements. On the one side, digitalization. Firms themselves recognize this is extremely important for their own competitiveness of the future. On the other side is climate change. In the moment in which Europe is reconfirming the very strong, the very ambitious target in terms of decarbonization. But it's not only that, there is the issue of education and skills, where education skills become particularly important in the moment in which if you digitalize, you need to have the skills to manage the digitalization process. And also if the climate transition is happening, you better are prepared also to compensate and have a just transition using the opportunity in terms of reskilling that you can have. If we go to the next slide, our main concern, this is more in terms of how you pitch the story that I was telling so far. So if we come from this very strong shock, and we know that at a certain point, the COVID crisis will generate a permanent change and firms will have to adapt. The concern is that the current slowdown in investment may generate some losers for the futures that are the firms that fail to adapt. So the important part on a policy point of view is to allow firms to transform, try to stimulate investment and try to stimulate targeted investment for the transformation. And again, the smart and green is what we consider as an important move to do. If we go to the next slides, that's again, I think my final message. We have seen a lot of policy support, very strong policy support. We see from the monetary policy point of view that the liquidity in the market is strong. Expectations are for very low interest rate for long still remaining. And the policy support also translated into reabsorbing spreads among sovereign in Europe, and also very compressed spread in terms of lending rates. And on the fiscal point of view, if we go to the next slides, the message is again that a combination of policies from various angles, European side, but also national sides, has really created the opportunity for a counter-cyclical buffer. So finally, my final message, we are really coming up from the biggest recession that we have seen so far. It's a massive shock. We see the potential for a recovery, but as a truncated V recovery. It will take up to 2022 for a full recovery, despite the very strong policy support. And the need is really for firms to find a way for, through the policy support, to continue targeted investment. Smart and green are the two areas of action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah, for this presentation. Yes, the issue of investment, as you said, they are impacted significantly, and it is a huge problem. How to, on the other hand, spur the investment in face of post-pandemic new normal, linked also to the European Green Deal. Our second ghost comes from commercial bank in opposition to the development bank, which was represented by Deborah. And I would like to invite Mr. Antonio Cortina to commenting first of all the presentation we just saw, but also, I mean, more broadly comment on the issues we raised at the beginning of our session. Antonio, please, floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this conference. Well, I would say first that the crisis has two main characteristics. One is that it has been caused by a health crisis and it's not due to economic or financial developments, and that makes it particularly unpredictable. And that's why we have different scenarios looking at the future, and also, well, the main institutions, financial institutions, have made a number of different scenarios and are monitoring and revising it every month, I would say. And the second point is that this crisis is global, much more global than the previous crisis that we had during the Great Recession, because then a number of emerging economies did particularly well. So this time is really global, I would say. But global doesn't mean that a global shock doesn't mean that we are before a symmetric shock. And that is very clear in Europe, where we have seen some countries falling up to 20% in the first half of the year. That is the case of Spain or the UK. And some others like Poland, Germany, or the northern countries with historical recessions, but not as deep as the ones that they have said before. And that's because the strength of the pandemic has been different due to how prepared the health system or even the population were to deal with a pandemic. Also, because a number of cultural and social issues, I would say social habits, or the number of generations living in a house that is very different in the south and in the north, or population density. Well, there are a number of factors playing in this, and also how fast the different governments react to the first stages of the pandemic. Second, political decisions. How strong, how long have been the lockdowns? How transparent also have been the decisions to get the support of the population with clear instructions and without big conflicts between the different authorities has been also important. Third, the economic structure is also different. We have economies where small companies have a higher weight on the economy, and small companies tend to be, the financial structure tend to be weaker than those that are bigger, or the weight of the different sectors that have that are more sensitive to social distance, as it is the case of tourist sector, or retail, or some others, transport, and so on. And then the room for maneuver of economic policy that is also different among the different economies, and the success of policy decisions that, broadly speaking, have been similar in the different countries of Europe, but the devil is always in the detail, and some countries have been more successful than in others. So I would say then clearly that the crisis, the shock has been asymmetric. We are facing the same storm, but we are in different boats. And that is going also to be the case in the recovery, depending not only of the factors that I have mentioned before, but also on political decisions in the next future. Some countries would decide maybe to partially discontinue the policies that have been implemented so far. Some others will try to extend or reinforce those. And some others will tend to recalibrate just to incentive a reallocation of resources, of labor and capital to those sectors or activities that have a better future, and left in maybe behind those others that doesn't have a future, even with the support of the government policies. No? So it will also depend on the pace of the recovery of the ability of suppliers to meet the new habits of consumers, the permanent changes in demand that is so far is not clear, the digitalization of the economy, how flexible they are. I would say that probably the recovery rates are not going to be so different from those of the fall, but given the starting point, it means that some countries will recover pre-pandemic levels at the end of next year, or even in early 2022, and some others will have to wait until 2023. No? In any way, I think that it's not clear yet when we will have the full recovery, the economic rebound that followed the end of the spring lockdowns are beginning to peter out. Well before we are back to pre-pandemic levels, the momentum is clearly slowing. What seems a second wave of the pandemic, whose strength is still to be seen, is leading to a new round of lockdowns, much more smart than the previous ones, but at least lockdowns anyway. And a concern about the outlook is clearly waiting on confidence and thus in expenditure. So we have to work with different scenarios. depending mainly on the developments of the pandemic, but also on the evolution of private sector confidence or policy decisions. Our base case, as I said before, is that there are a number of short, smart lockdowns as waves until mid-2021. Then we expect in this scenario to have a vaccine or an effective medical treatment that would allow a significant recovery in the second half of next year. And that probably makes the European Union to recover pre-pandemic levels at in the second half of, in the mid of 2022, but with significant differences among countries. Then we have a second scenario, negative scenarios. One of them is based on a double hit with a significant, a very strong second wave of the pandemic, or even with a delay in the availability of the vaccine. And that could be significantly tougher because most of the measures that have been taken to deal with the crisis are effective, particularly if the crisis is not very long. And then we have a positive scenario also. We shouldn't think that it's impossible to have something better than the base case if the pandemic developments, particularly the current wave, is not so strong. If the private saving ratio that is currently at 26%, more than double that of last year, gives significant support to private consumption in the next few quarters, and if the new generation recovery fund is well developed by European countries and domestic fiscal policies are supporting also in the next future the recovery. No? Just to end, I would like to make some comments on the new generation European fund. I think that is one of the best news we have had during the pandemic. We all know that the institutional framework of the Eurozone is weak. We don't have still a full banking union. There is not a common fiscal policy. And that's essential to face the current crisis, not only because of the direct impact, but also because what that means for the European future and to raise confidence on the European project. I think also that if we do the right things with this fund, it could settle down what might be the precedent of a European budget as a policy tool for the future, though it's still too soon. And of course, we need a good implementation with strong structural reforms in a number of countries to gain credibility among the different state members. I think that is also important because it has allowed to strengthen the political, it will help to strengthen the political weight of the European Union in an uncertain geopolitical scene. I think that in Europe we have two kinds of countries, those that are small and those others that still ignore that they are also small. No? And that's why I think that we need more integration to go ahead with this kind of projects. I think also that the two forms, the two focus in sustainability and digitalization are very good news also. We are well behind the US and China in terms of artificial intelligence, digitalization and so on, and it's very needed to go ahead with it. And in terms of the recovery for the short term, I think that it will support the recovery, but we shouldn't forget that this is I think basically a structural fund that should refocus the European economies to two of the main bases of the economy for the next decades, digitalization and environmental economy. But at the same time, it could help. And in that sense, I think that if some countries bring forward the resources through their domestic budgets, then they support the recovery of the European economy since early next year, waiting for the final approval and the developments of the regulatory issues that are still to be met. And that's all by now.
Thank you. One more confirmation that given the asymmetric shock, we may expect for sure even more asymmetric recovery. And now we are going for the Polish connection in English. That is Michał Dybuła, Chief Economist, Paribas Bank Polska. Please.
Yeah, hello. I hope you can all hear me well. Very good day to everyone. I think it's very difficult after the two speeches, the two interventions of my colleagues before, to add significant new insight into the debate. But perhaps I would start a bit with what we have learned from the COVID-19 crisis so far, and how it may affect the course of action, the course of economic development into the future. I guess we have learned perhaps two very important things. Well, first of all, that the COVID crisis is something completely different to the crises, to the recessions we have seen in the 21st century so far. And I think that this has been already raised by Antonio just before. It is not a proper economic crisis. It is not down to malfunctioning institutions or some imbalances that have been created and now are bursting. This is rather a reflection, and the spread of the crisis rather a reflection of the way we work and the way the way we live, and therefore it makes it so hard to predict more accurately the future. It is simply something of a different type of a shock than compared to what we have learned how to deal with such crises, such shocks before, and that is also very important because I tend to believe that because of the different nature of this crisis, we will most likely have to deal with more permanent changes in both consumer but also corporate behavior. It will simply mean that both in terms of what people tend to consume, spend their money on, will be different than before the crisis, as well as corporate responses to this crisis may be a little bit different than this was the case so far. Of course, we know that as in any sort of a crisis, the stronger entities come out most likely even stronger. The weak entities are getting more under pressure, which ultimately will probably lead to a greater wave of bankruptcies and insolvencies of the weaker entities, but also a bigger wave of mergers and acquisitions, both on the domestic but also international scale. But companies in general may also change the way how they operate. So far, it seemed that efficiency has been really the kind of key objective in corporate behavior and corporate strategies, maximizing profits very often for the sake of short-term gains was the key thing. Now the kind of robustness element is probably getting more important, just for corporate entities being sure that they can cope with crises like the COVID or something similar also into the future. The way how both the consumers or societies and corporates adapt to the new conditions may ultimately lead to more permanent changes in the world we actually live in. The sort of rules that will underpin economic decision making may be somewhat different in 5 years to 10 years from now than they have been in the past, and I think that this is very important. What is another important lesson from the COVID-19 crisis so far is I think that that is perhaps not something new that we have learned, but it is really re-emphasizing the importance of very swift and decisive policy making. Probably that is at least to a part reflected in economic performance in the second quarter of this year at the peak of the pandemics. That essentially those economies, those countries that had sufficient policy space and where policymakers were acting fast and in bold moves, they have on the margin being performing better, or the loss in economic output and well-being was relatively contained to contained compared to the countries, to the economies where policy action was relatively slow. And I guess that this is also likely to be shaping the post-COVID recovery. There, where policy making is fast, as decisive, even one may say a little bit too far-fetched, probably these economies will continue to be doing better. And I think that the swift and decisive policy making is also very important, because this issue of uncertainty has been already raised here as well. I guess the key point right now in the next months and quarters to come is because we cannot control so many things, we don't know how the medical aspects of the pandemics will be panning out. What we need is certainly more certainty coming from the policy angle, and therefore robust policy responses will be quite instrumental in reducing unnecessary uncertainty and eventually preventing a long-lasting fall in investment activity, particularly in the corporate sector, particularly in the small and mid-sized segment of that, where we know that these companies have it usually a bit more difficult than the big ones. But those are really the companies that come up for the bulk of the workforce, so they are very important from the social angle, from the labor market angle. In terms of the recovery shapes moving forward, well, I guess that given that we have this new and it seems a much bigger wave of COVID cases all across the world, all across Europe, I guess it's very difficult really to say something very decisive beyond say the next couple of weeks or couple of months. We know that the third quarter was most likely pretty good. Most economies have been staging decent recovery, at least in sequential terms, for activity. But that the outlook for the last and final months of this year, and probably for the beginning of next year, is much weaker. So therefore, the kind of U-shape or L-shape or W-shape recovery passes are still entirely possible. I guess what makes sense in this environment is really to work with alternative scenarios, to think what the future may look like if things are panning out relatively benign, but what would happen if the pandemics is a really serious and much more long-lasting crisis than we have been probably thinking a couple of weeks or some few months ago. So that's going to be very important. How does the European Union Recovery and Resilience Facility play into that future and into that outlook? I think that it was certainly very timely. It was certainly a very good sign, adding additional resources and providing a better outlook also for the investment activity and European Union states. But we know that very well. I mean, the devil is always in the details, and the proof of the cake will be in its eating. So how effective ultimately it will be to shape a new Europe to meet both the goals of a cleaner economy, but also a much more digitalized economy that is certainly to be seen, but certainly as an idea, as a policy step, it is something in a very right direction. It's coming very timely in terms of the numbers and how quickly particular economies will be getting out of the recession. Well, probably the answer is again. I mean, it's not going to be a very symmetric recovery. Perhaps in the pace of growth rates, it may be the case, but different countries, different economies will be reaching the pre-crisis level at different times. We as a bank are relatively optimistic about Central and Eastern Europe. Why? Because it doesn't really stand up with those industries that are particularly affected by the medical aspects of the COVID. So these are not countries that are driven by tourism, not are driven by these sort of services, are rather more reliant on industrial activity as a main source of growth. And here we believe the outlook for industrial production is a bit better than for services. We also tend to think that the region is relatively well positioned to take the benefits of eventually shortening of logistics and value chains because it has a strong industrial base already. It has been competing quite successfully on the European market for years. So that should support a relatively swift reaching of the pre-virus levels of activity. But countries that have been hit the most and where the structural changes also in terms of GDP creation, in terms of importance for labor markets, are bigger, such as Spain or Italy, for instance, will probably for them it will probably take it much longer to get back to the pre-crisis levels. We tend to think that this is rather be a story of 23 than earlier than this. I will probably stop at this point. Perhaps once more reiterating the point that the COVID is really a different type of a crisis, and it really has the potential to change the world we will live in much more than the global financial crisis or the European sovereign crisis did some few years back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michał, for this presentation. Now I would like to shift to Germany, from Poland to Germany, and ask Mr. Stefan Schneider, Chief Economist of Deutsche Bank, about his reading of the data, of recent data, and in particular, I would like to ask you about your assessment or your opinion on the efficiency and efficiency of the European money in recovery. What do you think? It will be efficient and timely? Yes, please, Stefan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. We have some camera issues, so you just have a picture, but I hope at least you can hear me properly, although you can't really see me, at least not in the video.
We see your photo now.
I can see myself. I can hear myself. If we look very briefly on the cyclical part of it, it has already been mentioned. We have a strong kind of hiccup. I'm just using my headphones. Oh, it changed the kind of feedback. So the recovery actually that started pretty much in May. And May, June, July, that were the strongest months. And if we look at activity data, we have already seen a flattening even before we got the kind of second wave from the new infections. So I think, yes, of course, the third quarter is going to be strong, although that's very much a carryover effect from the rebound we already saw in the final months of the second quarter. But further out, I think the recovery is really slowing. And I think one comment I would like to make, I mean, there was always the question, when would we be back to the pre-crisis level? I mean, honestly, I don't know whether it's going to be at the end of 2022 or 21. But I think one thing we should not forget, even if we are back to the pre-crisis level, we basically have lost 2 or 3 years of growth. So it's not, everything is basically out of the way. We are back on track. By that time, we will not be back on track. We have also to face the fact that a lot of capital will probably become obsolete, either because companies will not survive the crisis, so that capital stock will go. Also, we see that we have the transition to the carbon neutral economy. That means that another part of the capital stock will at the same time have to be written off. So we have various effects which will have a strong negative effect on longer-term trend growth. And that's really where the recovery plan comes in. And one could only hope that basically the ambitious aim of this program to basically boost trend growth is actually working out. But looking from experience, I mean, we have various challenges. I mentioned the shrinking capital stock. I haven't even talked about demography, which is a challenge which is going to have a negative implications for most of the European countries in the next decade, and pretty strongly. So I think we can be happy if this program manages to slow down the deceleration in trend growth. And to be honest, if we look back how the recovery program came about, I think there was a lot of haggling, which already basically highlighted the differences we still have in Europe. And I'm a little bit worried that given the uncertain implementation of this program, that some of these kind of differences in opinion will show up further, maybe let's say next year or the year after, when Europe will debate how efficiently the money has been invested. And there we might see that some of the money will not generate the high returns people are hoping for, especially given that those countries which will receive the bulk of the money basically manage to keep out any kind of conditionality. I think I would have been much more optimistic if the money which goes to that country, which they certainly need, would be combined with a strong shift for structural reform. So that might then ultimately lift trend growth, but I think the second part, unfortunately, is missing. I think I'll stop here for the sake of time.
Thank you. This was a point of view coming from the biggest net payer into the European budget. We are the biggest net beneficiary of the European budget. And now, last but not least, Mr. Selfin, Chief Economist at KPMG in the UK. That is Brexit country, but the paradox is that we are discussing future of Europe in English language. So English is left for us, despite Brexit, which is not my wish. So, Mr. Selfin, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to
Mrs. Sorry.
It is, but it's fine. I'm well used to that. Thank you for inviting me to participate this afternoon. All my distinguished colleagues have already talked about a lot of the issues, and I thought what I'd probably do best is summarize a little bit what we talked so far and add a few different angles of the way we see things here from the UK. So just to start by saying that there is a danger that this COVID crisis is causing a larger divergence between and within European economies. The recession is an obvious example of an asymmetric shock affecting the European and the world economy. Initially, this is the severity of the national outbreaks, which have tested the resilience of the health system. So we had France, Spain, and Italy, which have sadly seen more than 30,000 deaths from the virus, while there were less than a third of that recorded in Germany. And in terms of death per million, if you like, we have the groups of Spain, UK, Italy, and France that recorded a big numbers, whereas on the other side, we have Germany and Greece that recorded much lower numbers, much lower than the. So COVID also has been particularly detrimental to the travel and tourism sector, as we had with countries where hospitality represents a big share of the economy, particularly exposed. Greece, where the number of cases has so far been limited, could see a GDP drop of 8% this year, while for Spain this could be more than 12% fall, and Antonio, I'm sure, will have even a better number than me on that. So as we transition into a recovery, the risk is that the inherent economic conditions that are going to create a multi-speed recovery between different European countries are going to be more felt. The latest surveys still seem to be in line for most economies. There are very few significant differences so far, but the dynamics of the outbreak and the potential second winter wave could push countries more out of sync with each other. For example, France saw an average of 12,000 new daily cases by the 7th of October, and cases are rising in the UK as well. At least in the UK, we are seeing a greater reluctance to shoulder the cost of the outbreak from the public purse, which is also inflicting more lasting damage in years to come. And the role of the public sector more broadly in supporting me is extremely important in determining on how equal the post-COVID impact is going to be. So in regard to the support provided by the public sector, this is a place where we've seen quite a lot of activity and a lot of actions in Europe, and while Germany is well in the lead in terms of direct support to the economy, which their measures add up to about 8 or more of GDP. This compares to only around 3.4% in Italy, 3.7% in Spain, and 4.7% in France. So that is by itself going to make a big difference. And to some extent, this divergency reflects a gap in fiscal capacity. So the 750 billion euro package agreed in July could help address this, but it's unlikely to be sufficient to be able to cover this complete gap. And again, using the example of Spain, apologies for Antonio here, which entered COVID recession with an employment rate of over 14% last year, has now risen to 16% in the latest data. And economies that were already vulnerable on the unemployment side are unlikely to be able to sustain a strong recovery through growth in domestic demand. So it's not just going to be an issue with unequal public spending, but it's also the domestic demand, the consumer spending that is going to be able to react differently post-COVID crisis. Other economies in Ireland are still dealing with the legacy issues from the previous recession. And for Greece, the recovery from the previous crisis is still not over. Banks are still dealing with non-performing loans on their books and are now facing uncertain prospects for the tourism sector that my colleagues have mentioned earlier on. And then furthermore, to just exacerbate things on the positive side, if you like, we have some economies that are more reliant on external demand that could see faster recovery, especially those oriented on trade with China and Asia more widely. So we are going to see countries that are affected differently when we're looking at the recovery, because they are essentially exposed to different segments of the market. So for most countries, the recovery in 2021 is unlikely complete. So we've had mentions of different years where we could return back to pre-COVID levels, but as my colleague already said, that's not really the end goal here, and there'll be lost output in any case. The worst affected countries and sectors, especially the travel and tourism, are likely to see a significant number of businesses lost. And the loss of this organizational capital would hamper the recovery, as you heard earlier on. Any increases in unemployment are expected to persist, and the increase in youth unemployment could damage the job and career prospects of the cohort of young workers. So those countries where we have already higher level of unemployment are going to be more vulnerable going forward. Now, my colleagues have already mentioned the zombies firms or the failing firms. The increased levels of debt could encourage more zombie firms, which will act as a drag on productivity growth in the future. and a weaker recovery and low investment could prolong that recovery. Lastly, the increased level of non-performing loans could feed back into the real economy through the system and restrict investment there in the recovery, which is another significant risk that we need to be aware of. So, just to conclude, what are the possible policy prescriptions we could look forward to? In order to stimulate growth, Europe needs to see a major program of investment to close gaps, which is what we in Britain call leveling up. The range of areas, I've got 5 range of actions for you here. One is to focus on digital infrastructure that we had a lot today. The other one that I think is just equally important is training, especially in countries with weaker agile training systems, to help transition workers to new jobs and to new industries. Third one is to facilitate risk capital. And fourth one is to provide business mentoring particularly for SMEs and lift productivity. And finally, in the short time, it's very important to continue stimulating demand to avoid an economic slump and encourage private investment in capital and people. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. I have a supplementary question to you. I see probably London through window behind you, and I would like to ask you about the Brexit. And is this the Brexit is another or additional risk for Europe in the coming months or years?
Yes, absolutely. It is particularly a risk for the UK, and that's probably partially why our forecasts are for the UK only to return to pre-COVID levels by 2023, because we expect an additional hit, a significant hit potentially, from the end of the transition period next year, that other European economies, most other European economies are going to be less affected by it. But there'll be other countries, for example, like Ireland, Luxembourg, and the other smaller economies that are more linked to the UK economies that are also going to be heavily impacted.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have also a question from our followers in the internet, and the question is, I don't know, to everybody, I think, to what extent or how do you see the role of central banks in stimulating recovery? Is there any space for central banks or ECB?
But short answers, please, because we are out of time now.
Who would start?
Yes, of course, there is a role for central banks. In fact, the ECB has played a very important role in this crisis. And I think that in the very next future, maybe next month or in a couple of months, they will have to implement further measures in terms of quantitative easing to assimilate the fiscal expansion and keep finance as expansionary as they are right now. But I think that the ECB has its role, but we need other kind of measure policies to help monetary policy and to promote a structural change that is not the role of the European Central Bank.
1 minute left. Anybody else to comment for 1 minute?
Yes, perhaps
Not
very
so easy.
briefly, I think.
Michał?
Yeah, perhaps the central bank's reaction and the first wave of the pandemics has been quite telling. We have seen asset purchases not only by the usual suspects, if you may call it like that, but also by central banks of emerging and converging economies, and that I think well, first of all shows how serious the situation has been perceived because of the COVID-19, but to a second or to another degree, how the central bank thinking has been changing in a way that the kind of fiscal stimulus that has been delivered in most countries relatively swiftly has to be accompanied by monetary policy action to make it more likely to succeed.
So, well, we are at the end. At the end, I am to share with you my concern regarding the recovery program. It is not so difficult to raise money in the market basing on the perfect credibility of the EU budget. This is not so difficult to spend money, although for some it might be difficult because it is going to be about green money and digital money. But the weakest in this is the repayment scheme, which is based on non-existing own resources for the European budget. Many of them much controversial, and for this we need unanimous decision and ratification in the national parliaments. So here is the weakest point of recovery program, because the only one that is likely to be implemented next year, this is the taxation on non-recycled plastics, by the way, not so advantageous for Poland. For the rest, this is still very much disputed, recovery not yet agreed, but the most risky part is really misty repayment scheme. So this is a paradox because it is named Next Generation EU Fund, perhaps not a problem for the next generation. But now we both say very much thank you to all of you in this exceptional time to join us and to contribute.
Yes. Once again, I just like to thank you and present all our panelists in this finished panel. It was Mr. Antonio Cortina, Deputy Director of the Research of Santander, Michał Dybuła, Chief Economist from BNP Paribas Bank Polska, Deborah Revoltera from EIB, the Director of Economics Department, Stefan Schneider, Chief German Economist from Deutsche Bank, and Mrs. Chief at KPMG in the UK. Thank you very much. Now we will spend another 1 hour with another set of economists, distinguished guests, who will discuss slightly different aspect of this situation we are now. The title of the panel is "Do we need to rewrite the rules of the economy?" And we will discuss the issue of new normal in the economy and business, new paradigm in the monetary policy, fiscal rules, are they useless or not? The coronavirus and financial stability, global impact, imbalances, and last but not least, the secular stagnation issue. Is secular stagnation even truer now? Yes, please.
I don't know whether you share my concern. This was so much expressed in the first panel about this asymmetric recovery that could create or renew the tension north-south, so much visible during the financial crisis. Really, that is about the capacity to exploit relaxed growth and stability pact due to various starting points before pandemic. This is a absolutely different capacity in various countries to exploit state aid. Again, this is about possibilities of a national budget. It's absolutely different capacity to enter into the digital world and to comply with Green Deal. That might create difficulties in consuming recovery program, because this is about green and digital money mainly. So I probably you agree with me that this was so much expressed that it could create asymmetric recovery and also the tensions again. But now I think our contributors to the second panel are ready to start, ready for action. So please, again.
Yes, I see that our guests are already present with us, and I would like to present them from the beginning. So in this panel, we will have discussion together with Karsten Brzeski, Chief Economist, Eurozone and Global Head of Macro ING Group. Hello, Karsten. You are with us? Yes, I see you. Yeah. Shamik Dar, Chief Economist, Bank of New York Mellon. And Beata Jaworczyk, Chief Economist from EBRD, and Marek Roskrut, Chief Economist and Partner from the EY. Marek, do you hear us? I heard that you have some problems with microphone. It's solved. Probably not yet. We can. Yes, we cannot hear you now. So I would like to start from maybe from the lady, from Beata, and ask you about your view on these key issues I presented at the beginning of this panel, of this part of the discussion about the scenarios for Europe, macroeconomic scenarios for Europe. So what do you think? What is the new normal in the economy, and how do you think the recovery will look like?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be joining this conversation. So let me start by taking a step back and focusing on a broader background in the context of the new EU member states. So first, it's worthwhile to remember that the pandemic hit at the point when the region was already entering a slowdown. First 30 years of transition were years of easy growth because it was catch-up growth, it was about massive investment, about imports of technologies, it was relatively innovation-light growth. There was very little patenting going on in the region. And if you look at the data, the first quarter of a century of transition was marked by a lot of productivity growth. But after the financial crisis, a contribution of TFP to economic growth was very limited. So basically, the engines that were driving the last 30 years of growth are becoming exhausted, and the region needs a new model. Now, the region needs to grow based on own innovation. And that's difficult, obviously, under any circumstances. But it's particularly difficult because innovative firms are much more sensitive to the quality of institutions, quality of governance. And if you look at Central Eastern Europe and you compare the quality of institutions to best practice in the world, you see that there is this persistent governance gap. And yes, a lot of progress has been made in improving institutions, particularly in the run-up to the EU accession. But after that, the zeal to conduct reforms has fizzled out. So what the region needs is a new impetus for reforms. Now, against this backdrop of slowing productivity growth and search for a new model of growth, we have now three shocks. So first, obviously, we have COVID. COVID has changed the way we are consuming services, the way we shop for goods, and we will not go back to the world as we know it pre-COVID. Now, if you look at the pre-pandemic numbers, 3/4 of UK citizens purchase things online. In Poland, that was true of half of the population. In Central Asia, these figures were in single digits. But according to the survey we've done at the EBRD last August, small and medium-sized enterprises report that about half of them have moved their sales online. And that's even true in countries where pre-pandemic online purchases were in those single digits. So indeed, there are big changes that are already happening, and this restructuring will continue. The second shock that's already underway is the European commitment to low carbon economy. That goal can be achieved only if carbon prices will go up. And sooner or later, carbon prices will go up, and this will be a huge shock for Central Eastern European economies, which tend to be more energy intensive than Western Europe. The third shock is related to the European Recovery Fund. There will be a lot of funds available, but it will be a huge challenge how to spend the money well, because there will be lots of cries for various industries. Everybody will want a chunk of funds, and politicians will need to exercise restraint and to avoid trying to freeze the economy as we knew it in last February. They will need to resist supporting firms that have already been struggling, or firms whose business model is not suitable for the new reality. So we don't want to create zombies. Similarly, we need to resist supporting firms that will be unable to function in the low carbon reality. So we don't want to create carbon zombies. And I think two principles should be followed when thinking about how to spend money. One, money should be spent to create foundations for future growth. And here, the digital, the green are the aspects that should guide spending of money. And second, of course, we need to take care of people who will be adversely affected and who are adversely affected. But the guiding principle should be here. We want to protect workers, not jobs, and in particular, not jobs that will not be sustainable, even in the medium run. So the bottom line is that green transition is an opportunity. It is an opportunity to create a vision behind which Europe can rally. It's an opportunity to create an external anchor for reforms. Just like 30 years ago, acceding to the European Union was a vision that joined the populations in the regions, and regardless of which party was in power, each government was striving towards the vision. We need a new external anchor of that sort, and green transition can create one. And you may think it's far-fetched, particularly in countries like Poland, which are very dependent on coal. But at the EBRD, we did a survey in August, and we asked people, did the pandemic change the way you perceive climate change? Are you more concerned about climate change as a result of the pandemic? And 31% of respondents in Poland said, yes, we are more concerned. So there is a palpable shift in people's views when it comes to climate change. And, this green transition is an opportunity to support innovation. It's a vision that can drive innovation, and well endowed in skilled Central Eastern European countries, if they act fast, they stand to benefit from it. But of course, things don't have to be well. It don't have to go well, right? There is a non-zero possibility that things will go badly, that money will be wasted, that little progress will be made in improving governance, and little progress will be made in decarbonization. So what does it all depend on? Well, I think it depends on young people. Young people have been hurt more by the economic crisis. They are the ones who will be repaying the debts that governments incurred during the crisis. They will be living with climate change. And we know that young people vote less frequently than old people, so it's up to them to get engaged and change the political discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Beata. Thank you also for your warning vis-à-vis our part of Europe. We take it really seriously. Although, given the most likely heavily asymmetric recovery in Europe, I tend to see rather the tension between south and north of Europe. As for the tensions and problems between east and west, there are various dimensions like refugees, for example, that are creating bigger tensions than economy. But thank you for your warning, taking seriously into account. Next on our list is Mr. Karsten Brzeski, Chief Economist, Eurozone and Global Head of Macro ING Group. Please, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the invitation. I have to admit, I was following now the panel for almost 90 minutes, and I'm now seeing evidence that why Germany at least needs more infrastructure investment, because my internet connection is clearly slowing down. So I hope that my connection will remain stable while I talk. Just a couple of thoughts, and also to not to double up what we've heard already now since 3 p.m. this afternoon. Is this now a game changer, and how do we have to really rethink the policy mix? COVID-19 to some extent is more an enhancer, an accelerator, because if you remember, we had already been talking about secure stagnation prior to COVID-19. In Europe, we were already talking and discussing heavily about a Japanification of the Eurozone, of Europe in general, end of last year and early this year. So this is not new. And we also knew that when you talk about the policy mix, that the central bank monetary policy is more or less at the end of its wits. And they will obviously never admit they will continue doing something, but in terms of real economic impact, there's hardly anything that central banks can do. Central banks can just support fiscal policy. And this is the big game changer for me of this pandemic, especially in Europe, that we have seen a complete turnaround when it comes to fiscal policies. I remember that 2008, 2009, there was much more hesitance to use fiscal policies. If there was, it was only really short-term driven. Look, then 2010, 2012, we had this policy prescription of austerity measures and structural reforms. We all know how this ended up. And this time we had an even a swifter reaction from some national governments than from the ECB. So fiscal stimulus, first at national level and then later on at the European level, being extremely supportive to the recovery, is clearly a big game changer, and in my view is also here to stay. We know that at least definitely next year we will not get the fiscal rules back installed. We will probably have until 2022, 2023 a very loose fiscal policies, and this means that finally Europe has woken up to the reality that they cannot put all the burden on monetary policy and on the central bank. So a huge game changer. It's also a game changer that fiscal policy is not only used for short-term stimulus, the traditional automatic stabilizers, but that it is really used to somehow steer the necessary structural change of the European economy. We will see what's going to happen to the US economy after the elections, but when we stick to Europe, we clearly see when you look at all these individual recovery packages, when you look at the big European Recovery Fund or Next Generation, it is something like 30-40% of the money is at least aimed at sustainability, climate change, and also still partly digitalization. So this is very different to the situation we had in 2008, 2009. So therefore also another game changer that at least this time around fiscal policy is here and is really trying to increase structural or potential growth rates in the Eurozone as well. The other accelerator that COVID-19 probably has done is to remind us all even more of Japan. that, at least for the time being, this is all about fiscal stimulus. This is all about MMT, and I guess that the colleague from BNY will probably talk about it, how the US thinks about it. So the MMT has also finally made it to Europe. So I think this is also a game changer. When we then look at more at some sectors of the economies, and then because we hear so much, yes, is COVID-19 will lead us now to a greener economy, to a more sustainable economy, to a more digital economy. Well, I really hope it will, but we clearly have no guarantee that it really definitely will do so. And I wonder what this new normal will look like. I guess we all do. No one knows how it will look like once we have the vaccine, once our economies have returned to their pre-crisis levels. My personal view is that we will see some sectors clearly struggling for a long while, but this is more or less, this has nothing to do with analysis, and I think no one has the analysis. So how long will social distancing stick? Probably much longer than the start of the vaccine. So some sectors like the leisure industry, the travel industry will take much longer to recover if they ever will return to their pre-crisis levels. Then, yes, e-commerce, digitalization. So these are clearly beneficiaries of the of this crisis. So this will also be part of the new normal. It's more a question. So I'm wondering, because we hear a lot about this is now shifting towards digitalization, but the missing link will be investments. Because it's all good that we start to shop online. It's all good that we can do video conferencing and work from home. But the biggest part in the economies is still it is the industry, it is the companies which actually have to do the investment in digitalization. And I think this will be really it will be determining, especially in Europe, will companies have so much confidence in this new normal in Europe in general that they will dare doing these investments. Now, if they do, then the new normal could look pretty nice in Europe. If they don't, we will very quickly talk about all the doubts that you mentioned, that previous speakers have mentioned about divergence, about differences between the North and South, and increasing tensions. I'll stop here just for the sake of time, and I'm very happy to be a part of this panel.
Thank you very much, Carsten. I would like now to introduce again Marek Roskut, because there were some problems with his microphone, but as far as I know, the situation is much better now. And so Marek, as we exchanged emails, and Marek prepared some just a few slides. I hope that it will be possible now to present them and discuss on them. Marek, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My apologies for these technical issues. It's always a challenge to be almost the last speaker here and not to cover what has already been said, but I do my best. I don't know if the presentation is already shared or not.
Yeah.
Okay. So first, when asked about whether the rules should be rewritten, we should first remember that the world was changing already before COVID-19. But the current crisis will definitely accelerate many of these trends. The pandemic has made clear the tight connection between business and society. In particular, that society depends on well-functioning companies, especially in delivering necessity goods. As a result, expectations for societal engagement of businesses have increased. And companies, instead of focusing just on their cash position and shareholder expectations, for example, regarding the dividend policy or achieving short-term targets, they had to consider more of the perspectives perspectives of their clients, their employees, in particular their health and safety, and also perspectives of the government and the public. So in general, public responsibility of business will increase, and more companies will move from the shareholder-centric model towards recognizing the importance of all stakeholders, including customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and so on. Moreover, many surveys confirm that consumers and more broadly society pay more attention to safety, health, but also environment and sustainability. As many indicators in different surveys show that consumers are to consume more consciously. Discussion on these, but also on policies addressing inequalities, will be reinforced. This is what we can expect, especially as inequalities have additionally been exposed and exacerbated by the impact of the current crisis. Next, transitioning to what comes next will definitely place heavy demands on companies' ability to adapt and also increase their resilience to weather aftershocks. In particular, where digitalization was a can before the pandemic, it is now a must for many of them. Companies will need to maximize their digital customer access, data analytics across all data sources to analyze customer behavior will be even more essential than previously. And companies will also need to accelerate their moves to automate processes. Robotics will help optimize operations. But increasing resilience may also require reorganization of supply chains and moving away from just-in-time inventory models. So we may expect diversification of supply chains, rather a regionalization or nearshoring than onshoring, which in my opinion will be less frequent with some exceptions, for example, such as medical equipment. But this decoupling from China, it will take place, but not to the extent that as many analysts expect, in my opinion, not least due to cost efficiency issues. And we know that businesses will need to get prepared for new potential crises by building up backup plans. But we also should be aware that these new shocks may look very different from a typical downturn that we experienced in the past, and they may actually come out of nowhere, such as in the case of COVID. Another example might be cyber shock. And if we can move to the next slide, then this slide, it shows that COVID actually emphasized the role of international interlinkage transmission of external shocks to the domestic economy. So on this chart, on the vertical axis, it shows the percentage of value added generated in a domestic economy that is exported. So in other words, it shows how individual countries are dependent on the external demand. You may notice in particular in this, on the left-hand side, that US, despite being the second biggest exporter in the world, is relatively less exposed to external demand because of the size of its domestic market. European economies, by contrast, are much more exposed to external disruptions. And the horizontal axis in turn shows what percentage of domestic production is based on inputs created abroad, so foreign value added, and to what extent a given country is thereby exposed to supply chain disruptions. So again, we see significant differences across countries. And to be honest, I don't have time to present this, but these differences are also present across sectors, which emphasizes that value chain analysis, including susceptibility to external shocks, requires both country and sector-specific approach. If we can move to the next slide. So on the one hand, the role of exports till now has often been underestimated. In particular, our analysis showed that an increase in exported value added often accounted for a majority of GDP growth, not only in Poland, but also in many other countries in Central Europe in 21st century. On the other hand, country, but also sector-specific exposure to international value chains, both upstream and downstream, have till recently not sufficiently been accounted for in many risk models, including those models of financial sector. So we may thus expect some changes also in this area, however, probably not immediately. Another change that we may expect in global trade is an increasing role of services, including digital services, and that should be accelerated and facilitated by various technologies that enable remote work. And this remote work will also provide an opportunity for Europe that, as we know, suffers and will suffer from aging and contraction of their population. So consequently, many European countries will lack and already are lacking labor force, especially skilled workers. So remote work may thus facilitate access to labor force from other countries. So then already mentioned health, welfare, environment, or labor rights, they may also gain importance in international trade. And hopefully they will also become international standard, although it remains to be seen how fast their implementation will be. So then we may also expect that the role of governments and their presence in our life will increase. Whether that's good or not, that's another story, but already governments during this crisis, as already mentioned also by Carsten, introduced unprecedented rescue packages. And this fiscal stimulus will largely be extended to the next year, if not also to 2022. And for example, if the ECB is right in projecting that less than 10% of next generation EU funds will be dispersed next year, it will mean that the responsibility for sustaining the recovery next year will remain with the EU governments, which also indicates that fiscal policy may remain expansionary, maybe not to the extent as in the current year, but still it will remain quite loose, expansionary next year. But however, governments are also taking a more active role also in other areas of the economy, which is associated with the threat, risk of moving to protectionism. Currently, many countries are looking to protect their companies from takeover by foreign capital, which is often justified. However, that and also potential future bailouts of the banking sector in some countries, if affected strongly by the current crisis, may lead to nationalization of some top companies and an increased presence of a government in the economy that in some cases may turn out to be long-lasting rather than transitory. And last but not least, some politicians, but also economists, tend to use this crisis as an opportunity to get rid of fiscal rules, claiming that they are useless and they excessively constrain fiscal policy during the economic downturn. So in my opinion, there is a lot of misunderstanding here. So first of all, sound fiscal rules generally reduce the risk of procyclicality, mainly by constraining fiscal expansion during economic good times, especially during the economic boom. And by contrast, during economic slowdown, such rules allow governments to increase expenditure relative to GDP. And in the case of significant downturn and recession, such as during the COVID crisis, escape clauses are activated. Also in the case of Stability and Growth Pact in the European Union, such escapes have been activated, and those allow governments to provide additional stimulus to the economy. So we may obviously discuss some adjustments to fiscal rules where needed, but in general, I strongly believe that numerical fiscal rules should remain a key component of fiscal frameworks in Europe. So I will pause here. Thank you.
Thank you to you. Now, last but not least, Mr. Shamir Dar in wait and listen position so far, but now floor is yours, please. Chief Economist Benoit Mellon.
Thank you very much. I think I've got the end of day slot, so I'll try and be as quick as possible. I'm actually based here in London, not in New York, and BNY Mellon is a large, complex organization, so please take anything I say as not representative of what the company thinks, but my own personal views. The first thing I'd want to say is, in terms of rewriting the rules, is first to acknowledge actually that I think most governments and central banks and institutions more generally have had, quotes, quite a good crisis to date. I think first by stemming the incipient financial panic back in March, then turning on the monetary taps, and then finally engaging in quite substantial fiscal intervention, the whole sum of which adds up to about 15% of world GDP. Actually, I think the authorities have done pretty well this time around. And I think the lessons that they may take away from that should be, I'll come to those in a second. But I think, like a few of my colleagues have just pointed out, I think there were underlying issues, particularly in Europe, which will come to the fore once we are out of this crisis. They'll come to the fore again. I mean, the euro area, Europe more widely, does remain at risk. I think is mired in secular stagnation, is at risk of Japanification for three reasons, really. One, because the demographics suggest that. Secondly, there's the legacy of the financial crisis, which has weighed for at least a decade. And finally, then we've now been hit by COVID as well. And all those three things add up to a key observation about the European economy, which I don't think is often made by institutions and central bankers, and that is that Europe's deep issue is a chronic shortage of aggregate demand. It's not primarily a supply side issue. And I think that's pretty evident in the prevalence of and the fact that we see significant persistent deflation and negative real interest rates in the euro area. So I think it's worth remembering that the chronic issue is a shortage of aggregate demand, not misallocation on the supply. And I think that means coming out of this, I mean, I think COVID has kind of made that point very, very clear, almost clearer than the financial crisis. And I think that means challenges going forward for fiscal, for monetary, and for structural policy. Let me take those in turn. Well, actually, let me start with monetary policy. I think, as Carsten pointed out, I think broadly speaking, monetary policy is largely speaking out of ammunition in the Eurozone. Clearly, the ECB has done the right thing by cutting interest rates as aggressively as it has. And it's done the right thing by introducing the various emergency finance programs on top of what we've seen in terms of standard QE. So I think it's done a good job, but frankly, it's up against the limits of what it's able to do. And I think we need to accept that QE, while it must be maintained, possibly increased again if circumstances dictate, we must accept that its marginal impact has diminished quite significantly, and therefore we shouldn't really expect central banks to do. Against that background, I welcome the fact the ECB is conducting a review. I think that makes a lot of sense. We know that the Fed has done one, of course. Like the Fed, I wouldn't expect the ECB to move to outright yield curve control, although clearly one of the ways we're going to get debt down over the next few decades is by keeping the yield on government debt below the growth rate of various economies. But I don't think that should be made an explicit target. That would just confuse things too much. I think, and I hope, that the review will consider some proposals. I don't expect them to be enacted, but I do think that I hope that the review figures out that it is aggregate demands that's the issue, and that the most important thing that the euro area can do is to try to raise inflation expectations somewhat. The most radical way of doing that would, of course, be by raising the inflation target. I hope that's discussed. I don't expect it to be enacted, but I think there is a case for at least considering that. And even if we're not going to go that far, then I think some tinkering around the edges along the way, along the lines that the Fed has done would make much sense. But the bottom line is that we are faced in the Eurozone by monetary impotence in the face of essentially what is a flat money demand curve. And that means, frankly, I think more of the emphasis has to go on to fiscal policy going forward, and therefore the design of fiscal policy must be central to any reforms looking forward from here. So moving on to fiscal policy, what do I think about that? Well, I think we've had now 200-year negative shocks, if you like, in the space of 10 years, in the space of a decade. And that's really difficult. But I think what that's taught a lot of policymakers is that we need to reabsorb the lessons of what I call old Keynesianism. And old Keynesianism is more or less exactly as Marek pointed out, the idea that the economy, the free market economy works well for 90% of the time, but sometimes you just need government to step in and step in big. And that means ordinarily making hay while the sun shines, i.e. running very sensible, balanced budget, primary surplus, or very small deficit fiscal policy in good times. Fix the roof while the sun is shining, all that sort of stuff. But then we must be prepared to act decisively when required, when circumstances suggest that a big fiscal intervention is required. We should be prepared to go in and do that as dramatically and as forcefully as is required. I think the key feature here as well for policy design is that I think also what this has taught us is that risk sharing in the euro area through private markets and through national budgets works very well during those 90% normal times. And I think national budgets should continue to be the first port of call in the face of asymmetric or country-specific shocks. However, private and national risk sharing breaks down in the face of large continent-wide common shocks like both financial crisis and COVID. And so to some extent, there has to be a stabilization mechanism operating at the common federal level. And that's why I think the European Recovery Plan and common funding through the issue of European bonds makes a lot of sense. What does this mean for the existing fiscal rules then? Well, frankly, I would ditch the SGP. The way I've described the SGP, in fairness, the way I've described old Keynesianism, in fairness, the SGP, according to the letter of how it's written, corresponds to that very well and very nicely. But I think in practice, de facto, it just hasn't worked. It's been acting as essentially a fiscal straitjacket and imposing an unwillingness to act when fiscal policy is required during the crisis. And therefore, I think we need a kind of a completely fundamental rethink that incorporates old Keynesian principles. I think any such central budget should remain a tool of stabilization policy and not of structural fiscal policy. Key political decisions such as the size of the state and what national tax rate should be always should remain a national concern. But there needs to be a recognition that budgets need to be, broadly speaking, balanced in good years. There's a lot of background noise, I'm afraid, on my thing. So if I do stumble, that's because of that. Okay, and then so that's fiscal and monetary policy. And finally, let me turn to structural policy. In truth, I think there are structural issues with the supply side of the economy in the euro area, but I think they've been far too prominent and far too high up the list of the standard policymakers' exhortations in the past. As I said, I think the biggest issue is aggregate demand, not aggregate supply. Therefore, the last thing you want to do is essentially boost aggregate supply without boosting aggregate demand in a world where you've got deflation and negative real interest rates. So I think structural reforms are necessary, but I think it's important to focus on them in the good times, and also it's important to sequence them properly. I think structural reforms that damage demand or possibly don't boost demand significantly should be left till last. So anything that's potentially harmful in terms of aggregate demand, I think leave those to one side for the moment. Focus on the reforms that will tend to boost demand. Those tend to be product market reforms, distributional reforms, for instance, to pension systems, And last, but by no means not least, and most importantly, infrastructure type spending of the type we've heard described quite a lot so far already. And I think definitely things are moving in the right direction there. The structural reforms that damage demand, I definitely think should be left for later. So they tend to be labour market type reforms. I think they've been far too high up and far too prominent a part of fiscal conditionality in the past. And I hope that any thinking about those in the future will take that into account. Now, of course, what I've laid out here is always subject to political constraints, and I completely agree with the host's comments that the north-south divide, let alone the east-west divide, may make a lot of what I've suggested politically infeasible. But sometimes you have to take, you have to sort of make the best of a really bad crisis. And I think thinking fundamentally in those three areas about how we operate monetary, how we operate fiscal, and how we operate structural policy going forward, this is just such an opportunity. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Shamik. Also, thank you for going as high as the super national European level of reflection. Given that we have some time, I am ready to provoke you a little bit. Mr. Brzeski has introduced the notion of game changer, meaning possible heritage of COVID. For him, this is mainly about strong fiscal stimulus. For him, this is more sustainable model of economy. Here is a meeting point with Marek Roskrut. For him, this is mainly from the angle of being less exposed to external shocks, rethinking business models at the company level, more different consumer behavior, and possible renationalization. But let me ask you about this European level, meaning institutions and meaning regulations. I remember financial shock, 2008, 2011, and proud announcements. This was mainly at the level of G7 that we are under influence of this shock to rebuild, to reshape the world economic order. Nothing like that happened. The only reinforcement was about Lanciano regime institution, reinforcement of International Monetary Fund. But a lot institutionally and for regulations happened at the Eurozone level. Ad hoc arrangements were transformed into durable institutions like European Stabilization Mechanism. We have Banking Union, we have Capital Markets Union, we have Fiscal Union, a lot of unions, and still job in progress, not finished job. But in order to have something durable, lasting as a heritage of COVID, it could mean only lasting relaxation of Stability and Growth Pact, lasting relaxation of fiscal rule or dismantling of a fiscal union. So do you think this is possible, really? Because for me, recovery program and relaxations of state aid, for example, these are rather temporary solution. I am not sure whether this is going to be the lasting heritage and a real game changer at the European level. But perhaps I'm wrong. So please.
Is that a question for me or for?
To everybody.
Everybody. Actually, if I can just quickly go first, I'll just say I completely agree with Austin and Marek that this potentially is a game changer. My own view is that the fiscal and monetary response to the financial crisis and the COVID-19 crisis are kind of the wrong way around. We should have done what we've done with COVID-19 back in 2010, because fundamentally they're different shocks. This is the financial crisis was an endogenous shock, a shock that had come from over-financialization, overextension of the banking sector. And we always knew that would take a long time to work out, and therefore a strong fiscal response should have been first and foremost in our mindset there. with COVID-19, I think this obviously this is a shock. My own feeling is, contrary to some of what the previous sessions suggested, that actually it might be over quicker than a lot of people think. I'd have thought by the second half of next year, I think we could be in very much in recovery back to pre-crisis levels of activity. And if that's the case, then I think, yes, we do need to take lasting lessons, not just from this crisis, but from the two crises that have hit us in the past 10 years. And the key message there, it seems to me, is that fiscal policy is the most important stabilization tool in the context of when you're hit by a major crisis. And therefore, just make sure you make hay while the sun shines, you fix the roof when the times are good, but then you're prepared to use it really, really big when the next crisis comes along. And I hope that's the lasting lesson that comes out of this.
Yeah. Maybe
Beata, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, just some remarks, because Marek, I think, was more on this road towards the sustainable public finances. And I don't think that these sustainable public finances will be given up. But we all know that our Maastricht criteria were partly arbitrary. So this idea that it's all about 60%, I think this will really be gone for good. So that fiscal stimulus or fiscal policy will remain much looser than in the past. I think this is a given. Add to that the geopolitical level, namely that Europe is really struggling to somehow survive in this war on tech between the US and China. And you will not survive it by just hoping for private investments to pick up. I think this is clearly one at the European level. Final point, and you might also be hinting at that. So what will remain? Your question could also be, will we get the Eurobond? Because you mentioned the ESM, you mentioned all kind of banking union initiatives during the financial crisis, which we still have right now. But the thing is, will the emission of EU bonds, be it shore bonds, be it to finance the European Recovery Fund, will this be something that sticks after the crisis? And obviously, especially Northern European politicians will all try to make us believe that it's a one-off. It will not be part of the toolkit, but I think it will be part of the toolkit. So that and that could also be a positive part of this crisis, or a positive aspect, that we now have something like whatever project bonds, which are a permanent part of the toolkit.
Thank you, Karsten. I would like to invite Beata now to comment on that, because in my briefing I have you as a person who suggests rethinking the Growth and Stability Pact. What do you think? How it could be reformed again? Because as far as I remember, it's already the Stability and Growth Pact was reformed at least five times.
Well, it's $1 million question, but I think the reality is that Europe will need to learn to live with higher levels of debt, and we will need to have a conversation about the Stability and Growth Pact, and we'll need to have a conversation whether we will take it seriously, and if so, it will need some adjustment. But of course, it's a political issue how this will play out. But I think there's another space where we can see long-lasting legacy of COVID. And I think that may be in labor market regulations, because what COVID has exposed was the vulnerability of zero-hour contracts, of temporary contracts. And, over the last 2 decades, we have seen firms shifting the risk onto workers, in particularly workers who are least able to bear them, workers with little education, low-wage workers. And I think there is a dissatisfaction with that. And I think there will be a conversation about new social contract. And I would expect to see some tightening here in Europe, not in the US. So there will be this regulatory divergence, even further divergence between Europe and the US. Thank you.
Marek, last word from you.
So, as already mentioned, in my opinion, fiscal rules should not be abandoned. They should remain the key component of fiscal framework, but it doesn't mean they should not be amended. So indeed, the worst thing that might happen is that if we all pretend we follow the old rules, but in fact, many countries would simply not comply with them. So they would lose their credibility. Moreover, we need adjustments of rules at the European level because there is a lot of discussion at the national level in many countries on amendments of the rules, but at the same time, they should be consistent with the rules at the European level. So indeed, the thresholds for public debt would probably most likely should be amended, but importantly, the mechanism of the rule that would especially first and foremost constrain excessive fiscal expansion during economic good times, these rules should remain, they should be kept. Obviously, we probably will face discussion on some, exclusions from the rule, especially related to structural spending, on long-term investment related to green economy, transition programs, so-called golden rules. But the issue of this always is how to define this kind of spending to exclude it from the rule, while at the same time not to provide additional room for additional fiscal under the label of investment, while this expenditure actually may not be investment expenditure, but could be labeled in this way just to avoid additional fiscal constraints. So in general, we should have discussion on amendments of a rule to make them maybe more relevant under current circumstances, but at the same time, the general philosophy and mechanism of the rule that especially would work during economic good times, that should remain the key component of fiscal framework.
Thank you. Perhaps last, also a little bit provoking question. Do we need exit rules from the Eurozone? This was so much discussed during the Greek crisis. Non-existing, there are exit rules for European Union, now exploited by one major country, but no exit rules from Eurozone. What do you think? Anybody?
Well, I can quickly add, because it was my fellow citizen Wolfgang Schäuble who brought up this idea. I think it's nonsense because it is just an invitation for financial market speculation. Therefore, don't do it. Try to, especially not the temporary one. And we've seen that an exit for good, like we see in the case of Brexit. I think no country has actually really tried to do it. Greece didn't go all the way. Italy wouldn't go all the way. So in the end, I think these huge wings of the ECB are so comfy that countries want to stay within the Eurozone and definitely do not do this temporary Euro exit, that kind of training room issue. This wouldn't work. It only invites speculation.
Thank you, Carsten. Yes, I agree. I mean, the Eurozone is one way journey. I think that the discussion about new rules, new normals, new rules of the economy will continue. We are still, in the crisis, not after the crisis, and the lessons learned so far are not the final lessons. That's why we will continue this discussion, but not today, because we have to finish. I would like to thank all of you for this discussion and presentations. Once again, the panelists include Karsten Brzeski, Chief Economist, Eurozone and Global Head of Macro ING Group, Shamik Dar, Chief Economist, BNI Mellon, Beata Jaworczyk, Chief Economist, EBRD, and Marek Roskrut, Chief Economist, EY Poland, and also co-chair EY EMEA Economist Unit. Thank you very much for your participation.
A ja bardzo dziękuję Ludwikowi Koteckiemu, dyrektorowi Instytutu Odpowiedzialnych Finansów, Januszowi Lewandowskiemu, posłowi do Europarlamentu za tę fantastycznie przygotowaną debatę. Przyznają Państwo, że było bardzo ciekawie do tego stopnia, że panowie nawet nie zdążyli zadać pytań ze slajdu, a właściwie pytań od naszych słuchaczy i widzów. Podczas 10. EKF-u te pytania mogą być zadawane, jak Państwo zapewne pamiętają, w każdym momencie i bardzo Państwu polecamy tę dyskusję. Liczymy na to, że ten wyjątkowy 10. EKF, który odbywa się online, będzie wyjątkowy również pod tym względem, że będziemy mogli cały czas reagować natychmiastowo na Państwa zapytania. Proszę Państwa, za chwilę przeniesiemy się do naszego studia EKF w Warszawie. Spotkamy się tam z panem prezesem Zbigniewem Jagiełłą z PKO BP i będziemy mówili o historii tego najstarszego polskiego banku, ale to za chwilę. Natomiast chciałabym Państwu powiedzieć o jednej debacie, która się nie odbędzie. Miała to być debata o godzinie 18 poświęcona roli instytucji rozwojowych w odbudowie gospodarki po kryzysie. Okazuje się, że dwoje z naszych panelistów przebywa w tej chwili na kwarantannie. Nie jesteśmy w stanie przeprowadzić tej debaty. Odrobinę przyspieszymy spotkanie z profesorem Dariuszem Filarem. O tym jeszcze na pewno Państwu wspomnę. 17:15 punktualnie przeniesiemy się na rozmowę z prezesem PKO BP, panem Zbigniewem Jagiełłą. Zapraszam.